What is the purpose and value of a podcast? Many people want to do their own podcast. Why should they do it? What is purpose and value?
Having a message that's original. We're really both passionate about this industry. We've both got vast skill sets, but in completely different arenas within the industry. And selfishly, sometimes I even forget that this is being recorded. And
what about, right? What is your value you can give? It's not about you standing on stage and getting some fancy pictures. It's about the value you have to give to the audience, right?
You've got injectors that are really fast, they're really efficient, you're in and out in 20 minutes, and that suits some people. There's plenty of content out there that already deals with that or sort of satisfies those needs, and that's not us.
Yeah. Look, there's definitely been times, I'm happy to admit this, where we've probably bitten off more than we can chew.
We don't want to be paid mouthpieces for brands and devices, if you get what I mean. And so I think we've reached a point in our industry where you need to be good at business. You need to be savvy.
Now, is that the biggest source of income?
So we effectively become business partners with all of these suppliers, and as I said, it's still in its infancy, but we'd like to have partners all around the world.
That's eye-opening for many, realizing that scaling is not necessarily the pathway to happiness and fulfillment. It's a lot of stress, and that's one of the big future trends, creating these kind of communities. I'm going through this phase as well, and I think there's massive potential. Is there any topic which is currently taking off?
And we ask people to very specifically say, why do you want to be a guest on the podcast?
Yeah, I think there's a big need for... Today's guests don't need an introduction. It's Jake Sloane and David Segal. We have one thing in common. We both run a podcast. The only difference is my podcast is a tiny niche podcast, and these guys run the most successful and biggest podcast in our industry. This podcast is called Inside Aesthetics and is the leading podcast in our aesthetic community. Today, I would like to listen to their story and how it's going, and I would like to spotlight the business aspect of a podcast. What is a podcast good for? What is your audience? How to grow and build it, and many other interesting aspects. Welcome, Jake and David. Welcome to my show. Jake and David, welcome to my show. Welcome to Aesthetics and Biz. How are you?
We are great, Felix. It's weird to be on the other side of the microphone for once on a podcast. How about for you, David?
Yeah, normally we're asking the questions, so this is going to be a real culture shock. Yeah.
By the way, is it the first time you're on a podcast?
We've done a handful, but
not many.
It's certainly not many.
Okay.
Yeah, under 5, probably.
Yeah.
I'm honored. I really feel honored to have you on my show.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, cool. Today I want to talk about podcasts and the business of podcasts. And in the intro, I said we both run a podcast, but the marginal difference is that you are running the leading podcast within our aesthetic community, and I have a tiny wimpy pimpy podcast, which so I admire you. You're definitely role models. Would you share how it's getting started? What was the idea back then, and how it's doing today?
Who do you want to answer that, Jake or me?
Both.
One
can take the first part, the other the second.
Yeah,
so
I'll start.
Jake, you start with the beginning, and David tells me how it's working today and how it's doing.
So I guess to fill your listeners in who maybe don't know us or our story, I'm a cosmetic doctor. David is an entrepreneur in our space, and I was working at a clinic, and David purchased that clinic. He became the owner of the clinic, so we became good friends, and of course he was effectively my boss as well. And David, we used to speak every day when I was injecting and have coffee, and it turns out that he was into podcasts. At that time, I didn't really listen to any podcasts, and he was pretty passionate about it and how he thought it was a good way of learning. And I guess at the same time, as an injector, I was trying to find my way on social media and establish my own brand through mainly Instagram, and I just felt it wasn't the right way of getting my message across. I felt like you don't really have people's attention. They're swiping to the next post after 10 seconds. And so I said to David, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast to talk about our industry, and maybe it'd be a better way to sort of talk about some of these topics that keep on cropping up. And so I invited David to be my first guest. And obviously, I knew nothing about podcasts. I didn't have any equipment, and it was just a sort of an idea. And then, literally about 10 minutes later, I went back to his office and said, "Hey, actually, do you want to be my co-host? Because it might be a sort of a more rounded, more easy way of doing a podcast where we can actually have a bit of banter and bring your sort of skill set in as well." So that's kind of where it evolved from. Anything to add to that story?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. And I think worth noting, there was really nothing in the space at the time.
Yeah,
podcasts were still significant, but they weren't anywhere near the level of popularity or as commonly listened to and produced back then. So there was really nothing. There was a big vacuum, and as Jake said, there wasn't really any meaningful way to convey the messaging. And it was
When did you get
yeah.
When did you get started? Which year was that?
Oh, was it 2018?
Well, yeah, we started recording and getting equipment together at the end of 2018, but we actually launched on Apple Podcasts and Spotify 2019. So
just pre-COVID.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. About a year and a half before COVID.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting, David.
That's okay. No, I was just saying it's one of those serendipitous sort of events where, we sort of met each other, a lot of commonalities in terms of passion for the industry, and it just sort of, right place, right time. And there was no real thought process behind turning this into a business, if I'm really honest with you. And this kind of gets back to some of the conversations that you and we've had on the podcast. And one of the main, I guess, focal points of your inner circle that you recently did is knowing your why. And our why was, let's have some fun. We're really both passionate about this industry. We've both got vast skill sets, but in completely different arenas within the industry. And it was just like, let's have some conversations. And selfishly, sometimes I even forget that this is being recorded, and so I feel so honored that we get to have conversations with all these different thought leaders and people that are just starting in the industry, people that are really experienced international KOLs like yourself. And for our why was just have fun and enjoy the conversation. And the business side of things really happened after that. It was just like a secondary thought. Oh, we should actually start monetizing this because we're putting so much time into it. So the why was have fun and just have interesting conversations, and it kind of just went from there.
Yeah. Cool. I have to say, I mean, the podcast has evolved and it's still going to evolve over time as things change and new treatments come. But when we first started, there was, we lent a lot on people who we knew. So David had some, connections in the industry, and we did quite a bit of wellness topics. We spoke about nutrition and sleep and even medical cannabis at one point. And then we sort of, post-COVID, we sort of went very heavily into pure aesthetics. We tried to identify who our core listener was better, and we realized that they are highly likely to be cosmetic injectors mainly, but we do get people from industry and pharma people and clinic owners who are non-physicians and all sorts of other people listening as well. But I think our core listener is still an injector. But as you'll know from your own data, it's quite hard to find out who's listening and how many people are listening, and that stuff is hard to find. So we've sort of tinkered with what we're doing, and we'll still tinker in the future to sort of give better value and make it a bit more, I guess, relevant.
Yeah. I got it. Yeah. How's the metrics changed? So how many episodes have you recorded so far? It's, I think, 300 already?
No,
100,
well,
200?
nearly. So I think just published is about 254 last Friday, something like that.
Yeah.
I have to be honest, we've probably recorded maybe another 10 more that we haven't used for 100 different reasons. Some technical failures, some we sort of used our, I guess, administrative rights to say that it probably wasn't a good podcast, and we just decided to bin it.
Yeah.
So there's not many that we've had to do that. But sometimes if we don't think the value is there, we'll just say, do you know what? Thank you for your time, but it's just probably not hit the mark.
Yeah.
No, I get that. Yeah.
I mean, the overarching thought process from both of us is that whether it's something that is a money-making podcast or sponsored or some kind of partnership, the discussion has to be meaningful. It has to be fun. It has to be educational. It has to be engaging. And that is the first barrier that needs to be broken through before we consider anything else. So I mean, we've had situations where we've had sponsored podcasts that have been recorded, and it's just been a terrible episode, and we've just had to say, look, we can't take your money, or here's your money back, or let's do it again because we just can't put this out. And so that for us has been something we've held on to quite fiercely, is we don't want to put out crap.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I agree on that, definitely. How has the metrics changed since you're starting? How many listeners? How many listeners do you had back then? Probably starting with 0, and then it ended. So what was 100 probably, and then today it's what? It's 50,000, I think,
Yeah,
or
look,
it's
it's
massive.
certainly changed a lot. And interestingly, when COVID hit, I just assumed that everyone would be tuning in and they'd have more time on their hands. And that was probably the biggest lull that we'd had. And, you know, from a personal perspective, I was at home for up to 8 months not working.
Yeah.
But I was at home kind of not relaxed. And so tuning into things like an hour and a half podcast really kind of wasn't on my mind. I was worried about, you know, my future and my job, and maybe people weren't in the right mindset. So we did see a little lull. And then post-COVID, as everyone's got back into a groove, it's really taken off. I think that's when, for whatever reason, I couldn't tell you why, we really took off.
Yeah.
So now
Great.
we're getting...
That's very interesting. I would have expected that COVID was probably your high because everyone was on YouTube and
Yeah, I
Interesting,
mean, of course, our content changed a hell of a lot during COVID because we did remote podcasts. I was at home with my kids in the background and David was here. We couldn't see each other. That's actually when we transitioned to Zoom. So that was new for us. We had to get used to the technology, and you know it still happens now. But you know you're talking over people, the sounds buffering, and it was just really clunky for a period of time. And of course, because we weren't injecting, we pivoted to sort of wellness and COVID and a few other topics. And so again, the podcast maybe lost its focus because we weren't talking about aesthetics as much. Yeah. And then obviously when we're back at work, we sort of drilled back into the core philosophy of IA, which is injecting and aesthetics. So yeah, anyway, to get to your question, now when we look at our stats, on average it changes week to week, but we get about 60,000 listens a month, which is great. We're super happy with that.
Great.
But you know, it fluctuates. We rarely have an episode that doesn't hit. If all of them average similarly, but some trend higher. You get a well-known injector or a really juicy topic, and that's it does a little bit better. But most of them, they land pretty well.
Yeah.
Good.
And it's been interesting watching the different, because we can't get a lot of data around who's listening. I mean, the closest metric that we have is looking at social media. So we've got I think it's like 10,700 followers on Instagram, which is completely organic. We've never paid for any followers anything. That's just sort of grown on its own. And so we look at those metrics and we can see obviously the majority of people that are listening are female because they're sort of dominating our industry from a numbers perspective. Yeah. We know that most of them are nurses because, again, particularly here in Australia, there's more nurses than there are doctors in the non-surgical space. We sort of got an idea of age group, and originally it was Australia was our biggest audience for obvious reasons because we're Australian and our audience and our contacts are here. But now America's taken over in terms of like just sheer numbers. So America, Australia, but Europe's coming along quickly as well. But America with, we've got 24 million people here in Australia versus 300 plus million in America. So it only made sense that it would eventually take over.
Yeah. I mean,
that's amazing. Yeah. I think US is a super interesting market, and it's also my main market.
Yeah, and to be honest, we've not leveraged that for sort of self-serving purposes, but we know there are a lot of injectors in America. So we've had a lot of American guests on probably in the last 50 episodes, particularly nurse injectors, but we've also had a few Canadians on because, Americans tend to share this information more as well. They're really good at social media. They're happy to post and they do it really well. Whereas, we've had some huge names on, but they don't share that information on their Instagram. So we won't grow in certain countries if that information isn't shared. So, and I don't know about you, Felix, but in Asian countries, China and Southeast Asia, podcasts are just not a thing. So even though you've got, almost 1 billion people or more in China, tapping into that demographic is going to be difficult, one, because of language, but two, it's just not something that those people do.
What about Latin America? I would say, in regards of languages, you have very great AI tools who can translate, and we will implement these into our next events. So you can choose out of 120 languages to get a simultaneous translation. But my gut feeling is that besides US, Latin America could be a huge and very interesting market for our purposes. What do you think about that?
I reckon we might, we've thought about similar sort of getting some of our maybe bigger podcasts translated into various languages, but I think we'd focus on some key markets like Brazil, Colombia, maybe China as well. But to try and cater to everyone, just from our perspective, the admin burden just becomes almost impossible. I know there's a lot of automated things that you could try, but some of these things aren't cheap as well. I don't know if you've looked into it. We've sort of looked at AI technology and, of course, just editing these podcasts. I mean, I know that, you're going to have to edit this, but it's not cheap and it's time consuming. So you've kind of got to pick the horse that you think is going to win, I guess.
That's why I want to step back for a second and want to ask the question, what is the purpose and value of a podcast? Many people want to do their own podcast. Why should they do it? What is purpose and value?
Oh, that's a good question. Purpose or value to us as content creators, or purpose and value to the listener, do you think?
No, as a content creator, let's assume there's a nurse out there listening to us and thinks, oh, great, I would like to do my own podcast.
Yeah.
For what reason should she do it? Is it share the message? Is it because of money, or is it networking?
Yeah.
I interestingly had a lot of business contacts through my podcast. So many PE companies reached out and said, "Oh, could we come on your show? We are a private equity company wanting to buy clinics in US, and sponsors came and these kind of things." That was my learning so far. A lot of business people reached out and wanted to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. I think getting back to the why, and I think that having a message that's original, I think that jumping on the bandwagon and doing what other people are doing is kind of, I mean, they say that imitation is the highest form of flattery, but it starts to just create a lot of unnecessary noise, and I think it loses its originality and passion behind it. I think if you're just doing like a Me Too kind of podcast or piece of content, I don't think it hits well. So I think it's about being passionate about the message that you're putting out. So for me, it's about, forget about the money or notoriety or anything like that. It's just about, are we doing a good thing for the aesthetic community? Are we actually putting out information and content and having discussions that other people aren't having? Do people walk away after listening to one of our episodes and have learnt something or get some sort of positive message? There has to be, I think, an altruistic reason behind what it is that you're doing. I think that there are a lot of people out there that do these things for their own self-promotion, and I don't think that's enough. I don't think, because it takes time. I mean, any business takes at least 2 to 3 years to get enough momentum to be successful and stand on its own 2 feet. And so I think if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, or you're not motivated by something altruistic, then you'll find it very difficult to stay the course and to push through, because it is a lot of work. I mean, I think a lot of people just see a finished product and listen to a conversation and think, oh, I could do that. And perhaps they could. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the background in terms of just planning what episode you're going to put out, putting questions, coordinating times and dates with guests, especially when there's international time zone challenges. Someone turns up and they don't have the right equipment, or they don't have headphones, or they've got music playing in the background, or kids, and then the editing process, and then how you're going to promote that podcast. And we're still sort of wrestling with that ourselves, to be honest with you. So I think, to get back to your question, I think it's about being driven by the right reasons, doing something original that has your own take on it, your own spin that's original to you, rather than copying somebody else, and just being prepared to do it as a passion project. And if the money comes, then great. I think that when you chase the money, it sort of always eludes you.
I agree.
Yeah, it's like a mirage.
It's the same with the why thing at Inner Circle. We have the same perspective. Many people want to scale because for financial freedom or independency. I have the same meaning. If it's if that's your purpose, it won't reach, and you won't get there. Pretty sure about that.
Yeah.
But again, what you could do, for example, you could do a YouTube show instead of a podcast. So is there any particular value in doing a podcast instead of, let's say, a YouTube show or Instagram? You could invest your time in Instagram or TikTok. Or why do you think podcast is the right platform for you guys?
I mean, maybe it's just our type of listener, but the feedback, we've done a few surveys in the past, and of course we meet people at conferences and we try and get, some feedback about when do you listen, why do you listen, and so on. And the vast majority listen in their car on the way to work, or on the train on the way to work, or some sort of commute. So from a purely logistic perspective, that listener is not going to be watching, they're going to be listening. Because they're time poor, and it takes a little bit of different engagement to watch something rather than listen to something. And I think a lot of our topics don't need visuals. We do have a separate webinar series where if something needs to be more engaging or we need to show some data, we have that facility to do that. But our conversations tend to be well received, because some of the nice feedback that we've had is it feels like you're sat in the corner of the room with us and you're part of the conversation. Yeah. Now, it's a different experience when you're watching a video of, say, Joe Rogan or some other big podcast. That's a different experience. But when it's audio, I think you're brought more into it in some weird way. I can't really put my finger on why that is, but it's a different experience.
Well, you're forced to imagine. Your other senses aren't involved. You're only listening. There's only an auditory sort of stimulus coming through. So I think without the aid of visuals, you can sort of, as Jake said, you can kind of imagine yourself there in the room having this conversation. Whereas when you can see the video, you can go, well, I'm not there. Yeah.
and it feels more intimate, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that builds trust, and it builds your brand, and people feel part of it rather than just it's another podcast.
Do you adapt the time in regards of the fact that people listen to your podcast while driving? Well, let's say I would say probably most of the people have a 20-minute ride.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We don't, and we've occasionally thought about doing shorter episodes, and honestly we don't plan them to be any time, but they're very consistently about an hour and a quarter, hour and 20 minutes, something like that. Longest one we've done was, I think it was either with Kath Porter or Andre Brage. They went over 2 hours. Again, not planned, that's just how they went.
Yeah, it happens. And
actually, interestingly, I don't know if it hinders or helps our statistics, but that then gives someone content for multiple days, not just one day. Yes. So in a way, it's kind of amazing value for the listener. It's not great for us because it takes twice as long, 3 times as long. But I don't know. Once with a podcast, once you've done a warm up with a guest, you've gone through some basics and their background. You're already 20 minutes into the podcast if you want to do it properly. So I guess we don't plan it that way. It is what it is.
Yeah, and I guess there's enough short content. There's a lot of sort of brief content out there. Yeah. And as Jake said, I think it takes time. I think if you want someone to fully be engaged, I mean, you don't watch, if you're going to the movies, there's a story that you need to be introduced to the characters. You need to know what the plot is. Otherwise, you're going to watch like a sitcom, and the sitcom even then runs for multiple episodes. Yeah. So I think for me, when I look at how information is communicated and has been communicated throughout history, it's through storytelling. Yeah. Even when we were sort of in our very primitive form, sitting around campfires and sort of telling stories and fables and things like that. Definitely. And I think it's the same thing here. I think that people want to become emotionally involved in the conversation. They want to know who these people are. They want to know what their background is. What was their motivations? What was their early childhood like? What was, all these sorts of things. And then someone goes, I understand this person. I can connect with this person. And so I think that there is a temptation to sort of cave into the short order content that's sort of, I think, diminishing people's attention spans. But I think there's also, as human beings, whether we know it or whether we consciously know it or not, I think there is a need and a desire to get to know the topic, get to know the people, and have a discussion that people can then emotionally attach to. Yeah. I think people tune in and listen to us not because of just the content or the sort of the technical ins and outs. I think a lot of the stuff we talk about, you can go on Google and probably find most of it. I think people tune in because they get to know Jake and I, and they really get to know the guests and they can connect with them. I mean, when I look at our Patreon and sort of see a lot of the comments, especially around some of the Injector Diaries stories that we put up, and these aren't well-known people. They're not like, the Michael Caines of the world or the Arthur Swifts. They're just Joe Blow from down the street who's been injecting for 3 months and tells this amazing story about their background and how they got into it. And that seems to connect with people. So I think for me,
100%.
first and foremost, it's the storytelling and the emotional connection to the character before anything else. And I don't think you can do that in 20 minutes.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I completely agree. Many of the guests, not all, but many of the guests, we don't know. We've never met them. We've connected virtually through, an email. And so for us to make it a good podcast, we have to get to know them ourselves as hosts before we get into the meat of the topic. It's, of course, a lot easier when you know someone and you just slip into it and you're all friends and away you go. So a lot of it is to make it a good podcast by us being better hosts and building that story like David said.
Yeah.
Is it your own curiosity and authenticity which is quite a big power in that? If you generally interested in the guest, especially if you don't know them.
Yeah.
So you're authentic and interested and curious about their stories, and that gives us a kind of vibe.
Yeah. And I think that just as a patient will select their injector, as you said in one of our episodes, Felix, you've got injectors that are really fast, they're really efficient, you're in and out in 20 minutes, and that suits some people. And you'll self-select your own clientele or your own patients. And it's the same with us. We attract people that enjoy these conversations, and that's true to who we are. And so we've attracted our own tribe of people that love what we do rather than trying to chase people and not be true to who we are or sort of put on an act or try and turbocharge through conversations. There's plenty of content out there that already deals with that or sort of satisfies those needs. And that's not us. Yeah.
Let's jump into the effort. So my experience is either you do it on your own and then it's quite time consuming, or you have a team, but that's costly. What is your experience here? What is the amount of time you have to invest in a proper podcast and or money?
I think we were talking about this even just today because, everything that we've offered has become more and more complicated. Much more value for the listener and our Patreons and whoever's engaging, but much more complicated on our side. So just sticking to the podcast, I reckon, or we've estimated each episode takes between 6 and 8 hours from, zero to finished article and published on the podcast app. So David sort of told you the processes, but there's a lot that goes behind the scenes to the planning, trying to find a topic. And also we found, I don't know if you found it, that if we decide on a title of what the podcast should be titled, it helps sort of laser focus the questioning and keeping the brief a little bit more, sort of tighter, I guess. We've recently employed a virtual PA, Andrea. Shout out, Andrea, if you ever listen to this. She's been great, but it takes time to get to know someone virtually and for them to understand what the podcast is and, where.
What is her job? To edit it or?
No. So we have an editor down in Melbourne. His name's Andy. Shout out to Andy. Mm-hmm. He literally masters the sound. After we've recorded a podcast, what we'll do is we'll upload the file to Dropbox. I then listen to the podcast and I'll write all the comments in Dropbox about what we want chopped and moved and whatever. That's not normally difficult, but it's another hour and a half where I actually have to sit down and listen to it. Then Andy will master the sound. So that's almost the easy bit. The hard bit is the planning, the creation, the recording, the stuff ups, the time zone differences, and of course, recording the podcast. That takes another 2 hours from start to finish. Yeah, then I've got to drive to David, drive home. That's another hour or 40 minutes out of my time. And then there's all the social media and the webinars and the Patreon content that we're producing. So it's actually a monumental effort. Yeah. It never really stops. And we make it more and more complicated by adding more things onto it. But I think it's just grown organically over time. We have an ecosystem now. It's not just a podcast. It's Patreon, it's webinars, it's the website, it's everything.
Yeah.
But that's interesting questions for people who start off. And what I see or realize, many nurses or doctors have their med spa and they want to do podcasts, they want to be international KOL, they want to have family, and it just doesn't add up. And I think many people underestimate the effort things take, right? Time-wise. It's 8 hours. So if you invest 8 hours, it has to give some value in the end, right? If you would inject throughout these 8 hours, you would probably
be richer for sure.
Richer, right? So I think that's something we always do the token game here in a circle where we have 24 tokens, and that's the hours of your day, and you put away 8 because that's your sleep, and then you almost see most people have the time problem. They don't. They have too less tokens to dedicate to an area, and that's what I see as well. I'm guilty of it. I run too many things, and you end up doing mediocre stuff instead of doing one thing right.
Yeah, look, there's definitely been times, I'm happy to admit this, where we've probably bitten off more than we can chew, and we are running like things maybe on the surface look great, but in the background we're struggling for content. We've had guests cancel 3 weeks in a row. I've been away, of course. You have family and work and all the other commitments that is normal. And so it's a real challenge. And, we've tried to get better. We've now got Andrea, who's sort of doing a lot of the admin stuff. We're trying to plan out further in the future to account for disasters and problems and annual leave. But I don't think we'll ever be perfect. And sometimes we've had to hold our hands up and do a post on Instagram to say, sorry, guys, we just can't do a podcast this week. It's rare, but we've done it once or twice. Yeah. So I think our listeners are understanding. But, going back to if you want to start your own podcast, I mean, getting that momentum, not just to do 10, but 100, 200, that's the challenge. And so you really have to understand, why are you doing this? Are you genuinely enjoying this? Because sometimes, it's a slog. Let's just be honest. Yeah. So if you don't have an end game, whether it's monetization or for your brand or whatever you're doing it for, I would not suggest to start it. It's just not worth it. It doesn't add up.
What is your end game?
Well, I don't know if we have an end game, but I can certainly say that yes, there is a monetization now. That comes from various sources, and I think it's good to be open about how that works. So sometimes we do sponsored podcasts, but we've kind of decided both, one, because of the content suffers if we do too many of those, but also then we sort of get off topic and we end up talking about devices or things that we don't want to talk about. So we don't want to dilute the podcast with too many of those, but we've done, I don't know, maybe 20 out of 250, something like that. So there's been some income from that. But I think the bigger value and what has become more consistent is our Patreon. Patreon, if you guys don't know, it's an app that creators like ourselves as podcasters, we can deliver extra content. So I do a lot of educational posts about injecting. Of course, David does a lot of business stuff. And we've got to the point where we're posting several times a week now, high-value posts. David's doing videos. I'm sometimes doing videos. I'm sometimes doing more blog-style posts. But it's stuff that injectors can't really get anywhere else. But it also dovetails with the content of the podcast. So we might do a podcast on, I don't know, devices, but then David will do a video on, well, let's explore that in a bit more detail and talk about it properly. So injectors are seemingly loving that because it's almost like an on-demand support and educational system. And alongside the Patreon app where, there's sort of videos and posts, we've got multiple WhatsApp groups that, again, dovetail off the Patreon. So people now can access us, but also 330 injectors around the world who are currently signed up. So it's almost like this family where people are sharing quite a lot, to be completely honest. It's amazing. Yeah. Whether it's just social stuff, meeting up at conferences, but of course dealing with complications or tricky patients or business stuff. It's just almost become like an IA family outside of the podcast that is live and happening.
Yeah. Yeah, people seem to love it. Sorry, go on, Felix.
Now, is that the biggest source of income, the Patreon? And is it working like a subscription model?
Yeah. Yeah, it would be. I mean, when we do sponsored stuff, it obviously can pay quite well, but in terms of consistent, reliable income, the Patreon most definitely. And then we've got other sources of income as well. So we've set up a number of partnerships, and that's still very much in its infancy. So other than scheduled medications, which we don't want to get involved in, but when it comes to anyone that has a brand, a service, or a product that would want to reach out and get in touch with our listeners, we're looking to partner with them where our our listeners get something special, a discount for being an IA listener. We get a percentage of that for making the introduction, and the person we're partnering with gets access to a whole list of people who are going to be interested in what it is they're selling. So we've partnered with local law firms, suppliers of consumables for clinics, digital marketing agencies. And so that's going to be another source of income. So we effectively become business partners with all of these suppliers. And as I said, it's still in its infancy, but we'd like to have partners all around the world. So this might be a shout out to anyone that's listening. If you want to partner with us, we'd love to work with you. So
how can they get in contact with you?
So, well, we call it IA offers, but probably the easiest way is to go to our Instagram and just click our bio link, and then all of our contact information there. But it's just Inside Aesthetics Podcast on Instagram. And basically, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a business wants more customers, you need a way of tapping into a database, and we have the database, definitely. We have the listeners, and it's kind of like a try before you buy. We don't take money from the company up front. We say, we will market you, we will advertise you, we'll talk about you, and if our listeners are interested and your product is good enough, it will sell. So it sort of works for everyone, really.
Yeah. And we never wanted to run into the issue of just hitting people over the head with infomercials all the time. I find it really annoying when you're listening to a discussion that all of a sudden it says, hey guys, would you like to, buy this? And it's like, oh, hold on, I was just listening to a conversation and now I've been interrupted, and it starts to just disrupt the flow. And so we've never really wanted to do that. And going too heavily down the sponsored podcast route, you sort of then lose your identity. You start to become something different from what you originally set out to create, which was genuine content. We don't want to be paid mouthpieces for brands and devices, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, and I will say this, we get quite a lot of companies reaching out through email or PR companies, and it's really interesting. Some of the speakers that they put forward don't seem to be at all associated with our industry. So you get a lot of people trying to come on the podcast, and we say no far more often than we say yes. And it's actually the same for sponsorship. We've sort of turned down things that we don't think align with our brand or philosophy, or we just don't think it's right. So you could argue we're cutting our nose off to spite our face, but we want it to be valuable and to not go down the route like David said, where we're just selling anything.
And in terms of getting back to your question around what is the end game, so I mean, from Jake's perspective, and he can talk to this, I'm sure that the podcast has increased his profile not only here in Australia but internationally, so it opens up doors for him. Like, we would never have met you if it wasn't for the podcast, probably. And many other people. So I think it's raised his profile and opportunities. It's created a revenue source for me, because now I do quite a lot of business consulting and mentoring for people as well that sort of come off that. I've done a few talks at conferences as well now, so that's something that I never used to do before. And so for us, I think Jake eventually would like to inject less. So we'd like to get the income up without diluting the offering or sort of feeling like we've been bought and sort of paid for by someone, staying true to who we are. Growing the revenue stream. Jake can do less injecting, and sort of this starts to become almost like a full-time or part-time job, really, and it's a passion project. And Jake and I pretty much disagree on everything, and that's kind of what makes the podcast work, is that we're similar in so many ways, but opposite in many others. And so there's a constant friction there, which I think potentially translates into the conversations that we have as well.
But I think it's also challenge us to always be better. If we were in alignment with everything, you'd be in danger of being lazy and never sort of evolving. So, even today we're just talking about social media strategy and a few different ideas that we maybe didn't immediately align on. But that's good, because then it challenges you again to ask, well, what's the why? Why are we doing this? So it kind of works, even though it's fun.
I think that's one of the big future trends, creating these kind of communities. I'm going through this phase as well. I think there's massive potential. Having your own events, or speaking somewhere, or giving advice, offering mentorship programs. I think really it's a broad range of options. But I have a personal question. I'm personally struggling with saying no to people, and same here. Many reach out to speak, for example, in the circle of Ibsen Biz. And I'd rather would say yes if I could. It's hard for me to say no. How is it on your end, and how do you handle it to not disappoint people or make them talk bad things about you? What is your thought on that? Well, and how do you pick speakers or guests? What is your foundation of making a decision, or your framework?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, sometimes David and I don't fully agree, but that's because we've got different interests. And so David, he's really good at finding obviously business topics, but also he's pretty passionate himself about regenerative medicine. So, that's a path that to be honest, went down years ago. And I find it funny that some sort of bigger names in our industry are sort of claiming that they are now owning the regenerative space. I just don't believe that. But, we've been doing it for years on the podcast. Yeah. But in terms of does a guest give value? I'm probably, I don't know if you'd agree with this. I think I'm more, I scrutinize it more, particularly when it comes to injectors. I don't want to showcase someone who doesn't have something interesting to share. It doesn't mean they've got to be famous. But for example, our Injector Diary series, we're probably up to episode 20 now, or chapter 20.
Oh, at least, yeah.
I want each guest to bring something slightly different, a different flavor, whether it's a different profession, nurse, dentist, anaesthetist, whoever, or a different story, or a different model of working, or they prefer an unusual brand, or just something that makes it different.
Yeah.
We could easily lean on the most famous injectors around the world and just do them. But eventually that becomes extremely boring. So I try to sort of do a little bit more digging and understanding of what is their reason to come on, because of course they're going to get a huge PR sort of boost by coming on and talking about their clinic and their way of doing things. But it also has to serve our listener. So I always try and think from our listener's perspective. Anything to add to that?
I agree.
I think you just can't be everything to everybody. And I think that if you're trying to please everybody, you could potentially end up disappointing yourself. Because, you run yourself too thin. You start not becoming as best as you can be when you're saying yes to everything and every opportunity. So I think, as Jake said, it always comes back to what is the core belief of the podcast? Why did we do this? It was to have interesting conversations. Well, that's the overarching rule that needs to be satisfied. Is this an interesting conversation? Have we had this conversation before? Is this guest going to bring something to the table that someone else hasn't, or from a from a slightly different perspective? So I think that, what other people think about you is not really any of your business. I think that's easy to say. And I think we live in this world where everyone's hyper conscious about what everyone thinks about everyone else. But I think if you focus on that too much, the person that ends up suffering the most is you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And it's your brand or our brand at the end of the day. So if we open up the floodgates and say anyone can come on, it's easy, then our listeners will very quickly just turn off. They'll realize that something has changed. We do have now a slightly more formal pathway, and I think it makes it a little bit easier for us to say no. It's not sort of, we're happy to have that conversation, but we ask people to sign up online through our website. So if you're interested and you're listening, we're happy to listen. Just go to join as a guest, and then you can apply there. And we ask people to very specifically say, why do you want to be a guest on the podcast? It's got to make sense, right? Because we have had people reach out,
and it needs to be the right reason. It's not about them. I have the problem. So I want to be on stage. I want to speak more. Well, what about, right? What is your value you can give? It's not about you standing on stage and getting some fancy pictures. It's about the value you have to give to the audience, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We're at a really interesting time in our industry, as we've spoken about, sort of to the point of almost sounding repetitious, where we haven't really had to be really good at anything other than injecting, and even sometimes not even that, and people have been successful. And so I think we've reached a point in our industry where you need to be good at business, you need to be savvy, you need to be different, you need to be really driven by the right reasons. And so I think this is the time more than ever before in our space where you really need to get back into your why and recognize where your strengths and weaknesses are, and what is it about you that makes you different from your competitor down the road. Because I think that over the next 2 to 3 years, maybe even less, the industry is going to identify those people that shouldn't be here, and it's going to remove them from the space, whether they go of their own decision or whether they're forced. I really think we're heading down that path. And then also we're evolving. As Jake said, the regenerative space was always on a collision course with aesthetics. It made sense. And so I think it's about how, continuing to reinvent yourself.
Do you see these, thank you, David, for diving into these topics. Do you see some kind of trends, or Jake, trends towards what are people interested? What is your audience interested in? Is it business? Is it longevity? Is there any topic which is currently taking off?
Look, when we introduce business more regularly, that certainly resonated with people because they're struggling, and it's not their skill set. So that has become a regular feature for sure, and you've been part of that as well on some of our podcasts. The regenerative stuff, like I said, we've touched on many of these topics, and I mean, actually, the podcast started with the mantra "look good, feel good," and we realised that they can't be separated. You've got to look good to feel good, and feel good, you've got to look good, and so on.
Definitely.
So whilst it's become cool and trendy to talk about regenerative aesthetics or regenerative medicine, it hasn't really just come out of nowhere. It's always been there. But I think, with sort of, research done by David Sinclair and whoever, it's becoming more well known. And, to be honest, I think there's a little bit of a selfish angle from clinics who are just looking for another revenue stream. They're not really interested in it. They just want to add more stuff to their menu. So those people, again, if they don't have a passion or an understanding for it, they'll also fall by the wayside. But it's clearly here to stay, and clearly things will get more interesting and more useful and applicable in our clinics as time goes on. But what do you think is trending?
Trending in the business space, or
in general.
I think people being hungry for business education is definitely on the rise, and I think there is a market there that needs to be catered for in terms of educating these people. I mean, one of the big eye-opening moments for me is sort of realizing how uneducated most people are, and that's not a knock on anyone. It's because you go to medical school or nursing school. No one's teaching you this stuff. So why would I be silly enough to expect that people would understand? But I was traveling along in this industry for 15 to 20 years in my own world, not really knowing what everyone else was doing. So it's been an eye-opening moment for me to sort of realize people really, really need assistance with this. And it's not with complicated stuff. It's with a lot of the basics, really.
Understanding the basics,
definitely. The basics. And people actually now starting to think about things at a deeper level rather than just being good practitioners, which is... And then also people now starting to think about their exit strategies, which were conversations that were never being had before. So, I mean, that's certainly something, those conversations are happening more regularly for me. In terms of what's trending, I mean, gosh.
If I could ask you a question, Felix. I mean, you've just held the inner circle. What topics were people wanting to sort of talk about that they didn't feel sort of...
That's a very interesting question. I would agree with you guys that business topics are evolving because competition is higher and many people struggle. It is, interestingly, a lot around the why thing. What is my real purpose? Time management is a big topic. Understanding financials. And sometimes it's just as simple as you have a revenue stream and you have costs and there's something in between, which is called profit. And then you have to deduct interest rates and other stuff, and then you have your income and then taxes, and just show these simple things, and you have investments. And I think as it's dominated by women, our industry needs, if it would be only men, I would probably have a different approach. And what we do at Inner Circle is to wave in these kind of emotions and vulnerability and honesty and share our struggles and fears. And that opens up because everyone realizes, gosh, so much of a relief that people like Tim Peters or Felix do struggle the same way that we do. I think there's some gold into that. This Inner Circle was again to my consideration, the successful ones. So it was even more successful than last year. We have 70 people on the waiting list. We're going to Miami in October, so I'm pretty sure that will be booked out soon. So I think there's a big need for these kind of topics. And you can wave in longevity, right? I was sharing my story of my biological age, which is 74. I told you, and I relate that to stress and lifestyle and alcohol and sleeping pills and lack of sleep. Now I'm on this journey to reverse it, and that's eye-opening for many. realizing that scaling is not necessarily the pathway to happiness and fulfillment. It's a lot of stress. And, when you initially start with a single med spa, you earn quite well if you're good. But when you start this journey of scaling, then there is a desert for like 3 or 4 or 5 years, because you have to take yourself out of the business a little bit to manage your business. People you hire mostly don't gain the same revenue than you do. Then they ask for big salaries and all these kind of things. So you will find that your business in terms of numbers is dropping. And only once you get to a certain volume, then you can hire admin people and leaders and all these kind of things. So I think a lot of people in our industry just jump into topics quite naively. It's with maybe podcasts, training institutes. Everyone is opening a training institute right now. So I see my mission a little bit of, wouldn't say preventing them into running naively into new endeavors, but sharing my experience and let people speak who have some kind of similar experiences,
Yeah.
and help them find their why and their passion, and then be successful
Yeah.
in their own style with something distinctive. And not, we have the tendency of all doing the same, right? We all do the same. So someone opens up a training institute, and then the second and the third, say for content on Instagram, everyone is doing the same dances and same whatever.
Yeah. Well, people follow
What do you
people, don't
think?
they? Well, it's a herd mentality. It's
Sheeple.
it's an evolutionary trait that we have as human beings to conform to the herd. That's how we survived, right?
Absolutely.
So we can't fight that, and that is what it is. But I mean, some of the conversations I'm having with my clients is, what does success actually even mean? I mean, do you need to have a massive business to be successful? I mean, are you actually earning? I mean, let's wind it back even a step further from that. Like, what is it that you value in your life?
Yeah.
Is it money?
I
Is it
agree
time
so
with your
much,
family?
Dave.
Is it time to
Yeah.
travel the world? Is it time? Do you want to be able to enjoy things while you're still able-bodied and young? Do you want to work until you're almost, a corpse, and then you're going to go traveling around the world? I mean, what's the purpose of that? So for me, the most valuable commodity that we have as human beings on this planet is time, because it's something you can't make more of. You can make money. I've made plenty of money, and I've lost a ton of money as well.
Yeah.
I
couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more.
And so some of the conversations I'm having is, well, what's important to you? Well, what does success mean? You've got this clinic with all these injectors and staff. How much money are you actually making, and how much time are you spending stressing about this?
Yeah.
Let's run the numbers here. What if it was just you again? What if you were
definitely.
working for somebody else? What if you could just come in and collect a paycheck?
Yeah.
And you're still
And
earning
have
great
freedom.
money? I mean, so this is just a vehicle. I mean, any job you have, any career is a vehicle to take you where you want to get to in life.
Absolutely.
And so,
and the misconception of having more freedom and more time when you're self-employed or run your own is absolutely wrong. We had this guy from Sweden here, Marco. He has like 5 clinics. Said, I wish so much to get rid of the responsibilities, right? And having your own clinic is not more freedom. It's the opposite. You work more. You work on weekends. You work on evenings. If there's something going wrong, it's you they call, right?
Yeah. If you don't like the situation and you're working for somebody else, you can pick up your bag and go somewhere else. Not so easy to just shut down a business and walk away from your debts and your financial commitments. So, and I think as well, we've sort of almost created this expectation that you have to have your own business to be successful in this space.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not the case. And I think people rush into businesses too quickly. We've sort of, this whole sort of nurse entrepreneur, it's not a knock on nurses. I mean, that's just the latest kind of trend, which has been nurses opening their own businesses. Whatever happened to when you learn a new skill, you go and do an apprenticeship for 2 or 3 years. If I want to go and learn to become a plumber or an electrician or a builder, I go and work for somebody. I learn my craft slowly, properly with someone that can mentor me through that process. I think there's people are feeling the pressure to open up their own businesses. And I think it's a mistake, really. I think we're pushing ourselves too far, expecting too much too soon. There's only so much. It takes time to acquire a skill set. And even if someone shows you all the technical information, how long until it becomes second nature?
Shortcuts.
I often get asked by people, why do I not have my own clinic? And I guess I've identified that's not my passion. It's not my why. I love injecting, and it makes me so happy every day, and I absolutely love it. But I don't need to run a business as well, and I don't need a team, and I don't need a chain of Dr. Jake Sloane clinics. It's not really what gets me up in the morning.
Thank you for sharing that. Amazing. Closing question, Jake, what is your dream for the future? And David, what is your dream for the future?
My dream for my future is that my children are happy and safe.
Great.
Wow.
Gosh. Like that one. David?
Gosh, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. My dream. I've got so many. How do I distill them down into one?
You can have 5 dreams. I allow you to share 5 dreams.
I mean, continue to live a happy and successful, fulfilled life, to positively impact people around me, whether it be professionally or personally, and just leave this world with no regrets. Really, I think too many people spend their time doing things that make them unhappy, spending time doing things that are, in the end, meaningless. And so I think, when my time comes, I want to look back and say I have minimal regrets, and I've had a positive impact on the people that I've come into contact with.
I love that. 2 great answers. Thank you so much. Thank you, my friends, for being on the show. I really appreciate that. It was amazing conversation, and can't wait to release this episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting us, Felix. Hope to get to see you soon, and maybe we'll come to the Inner Circle next year.